Everybody. I am very happy to be here with you today, and particularly happy to share my work with you. For the last 3 decades, my work's focused on methods to improve the diagnosis and treatment of brain injury, and I have a special interest in mild traumatic brain injury. Let's see, we're having some audio issues. Sorry about that. And particularly the long-term effects of brain injury. I'm a professor at the University of Oregon, and that's been my area of research for a long time. And I want to start by saying how heartening it has been to see the realization really across society of the high numbers of people that are affected by mild traumatic brain injury, and more importantly, the appreciation of how devastating these effects can be. I'm going to advance my slides here. Let's see. There we go. I think we're in business now. Here's my disclosures. And I want to move on to this slide. It's a list by Kreutzer and Hugh, and I believe it's probably familiar to all of you who work with students who've had mild traumatic brain injury or concussion. I've added a few examples of my own. So statements such as I'm disorganized and can't manage my assignments, I go to class but nothing sinks in, are very common issues that we see. Okay, it sounds like there's a little issue with the screen. I'm going to pause here to make sure that everybody has the visual that they need. Okay, let's see, that should be working. Okay, sorry we're hit a little rough patch, but I think we're smooth now. Let me go back. These were my disclosures, and here was the list that I think you can now see. Statements such as my headaches are so bad I can't read. I'm disorganized and can't manage my assignments. These are the issues that our students are facing that we're trying to help them with. Mild traumatic brain injury, also called concussion, they're synonymous, is a national health concern. The good news is that most people fully recover in 7 to 10 days, but that's not the group that we're concerned with. Approximately 15% of the individuals experience physical, academic, and social challenges after 3 weeks. And while 15% may not seem like a lot, the numbers themselves are large, so 15% is concerning. And a concern to those of us that work with youth, that population, young people, are at the highest risk for persistent problems and represent the highest incidence group. This is a graphic I've made to illustrate kind of where we are now and ideally where we'd like to go. So everybody has an acute phase when they have a concussion. And this slide shows what our charge is. Currently, people kind of move from acute with that 15% moving to persistent. And what's missing is what we have on the bottom, a focus on early management so that we can shrink that green and orange bubbles. So that's really our charge. I'm going to talk a bit about early management because I think this is what's going to really help us get the numbers of people that are suffering persistent effects to lessen. And then I'm going to move on to talk about treatment of students with persistent effects following concussion. So here's the goals. I'm hoping at the end of this that you'll feel like you have some ideas about how we might lessen the numbers of people that have symptoms and have some ideas about how we can reduce the cognitive symptoms. That's particularly the area that we'll be talking about, and you'll see the topics on the second half of the slide that I hope will get us there. So the current landscape, there is some good news in the current landscape. What we have developed in the last few years is multiple options for progressive step guidelines for returning to play and to learn after concussion. And this is very important and is being implemented more and more successfully. And so we want to celebrate our progress. Unfortunately, however, we continue to have very poorly specified recommendations across different providers for how to manage ongoing symptoms. There's really no standardized protocols for treating the complicated interacting symptoms that we see in individuals. The future ideal, and one that's recommended by a number of international consensus panels, is that if we see symptoms persisting beyond 10 days, that we have a multidisciplinary team of people that have expertise in academic, medical, for example, headaches, cognitive, attention, memory issues, emotional, and vestibular support. These are the symptom areas that we see problems, and they require different specialties. So how can we move to that ideal state? These are some of the prerequisites that would be required. We need to understand the mediators of persistent concussion symptoms, and we need to have established methods for cross-sector communication. So that multidisciplinary group I just mentioned, those disciplines need to have easy, efficient ways to talk across each other in order to coordinate to treat individuals who have very different symptom profiles. And what we'll talk about today is we need to know what options are for managing the cognitive impairments that are based on the best current evidence. So maybe we can start with building some of that prerequisite knowledge. For these next few slides, I want to say a little bit about concussion and provide some background. I don't think we have to be scientists or medical providers, but I think it is important to understand that there are neurophysiological changes that in most people right themselves. They get better. You have some sort of biomechanical force to the head or neck, and it causes rapid and massive cell firing, and that results in this huge ionic flux or chemical flux. And increased potassium and calcium are what have been most implicated in what we call this metabolic crisis, so this metabolic cascade. Now, it takes energy in the form of glucose to pump out all this extra potassium that's been poured in as a result of these cells firing. And with that glucose being used, you get an energy crisis. The cells can't fire, they can't be reactivated. The extra calcium can be particularly hard on our axonal connections, our nerve pathways, the structure. There's also a change in cerebral blood flow. So we have all these things we know about, and I might add, they've mostly been studied in rats. So we know this metabolic cascade happens in rats. We don't know how well it transfers to humans. But I think the bottom line I want you to know is that you get a metabolic depression, and that for most people this is short. But if you stay in this state, you end up with more severe symptoms. Now, these steps are not a linear sequence, and they can occur, you might skip some, and they might not occur for everyone. But the important thing to know is that there's a real neurophysiological reason why people feel crummy after a concussion. Another hallmark of concussion is that there's a gradual improvement of symptoms. Different symptoms resolve at different rate. That's a hallmark characteristic again, and it's variable across people. The literature has identified different clusters that might resolve. So there's a group of physical and somatic symptoms. For example, dizziness, headaches, light sensitivity. There's a group of cognitive symptoms, memory, attention issues. There's a group of emotional and behavioral symptoms, feeling agitated, stressed. So that's a symptom that we want to be really mindful of, is that there's going to be a different time resolution for different symptoms, and that's going to vary across people. The next two bullets highlight two important changes in our approach to concussion management. We used to think and focus on loss of consciousness or length of memory problems as a way to measure severity, and that's no longer the metric. We've moved to, or are gradually moving toward, grading severity of concussion by the type of symptoms, the number of symptoms, and the severity of symptoms. And that's what I think is going to be evolved, where it'll be a much there'll be more standardized protocols for that. So type, number, severity of symptoms. The other change is the last bullet, where we encourage reactivation rather than the previous recommendations, where you have people sit in a dark room, cocoon them, dark cocooning, and wait for the symptoms to go away with no stimulation until the symptoms change. That's no longer the recommended practice. Instead, we push reactivation, gradual reactivation. The next couple of slides are for your reference, and I'm not going to discuss in detail, but I want to highlight a few important points. This iceberg slide is to remind us, those of us that focus on the learning or cognitive aspects of concussion symptoms, it's to remind us that those symptoms are just the tip of the iceberg. So in my practice, we talk about attention, memory, executive function issues. This is what we cognitive interventionists would focus on. However, there's a whole bunch of issues beneath the iceberg that affect and that can cause or can interact with cognitive symptoms. And we might divide them into these categories. Iatrogenic factors, which are things that are caused by treatment providers. For example, sometimes a neck injury, cervicogenic diagnosis is what would be more appropriate, but we say it's a concussive or cognitive symptom. And so people have misattribution of what's wrong with them. Over-testing. In other words, we do things that create an expectation of lasting symptoms, which is not helpful. Comorbid conditions such as depression, anxiety, PTSD can cause or interact with cognitive symptoms. Psychological factors, being hypervigilant on your symptoms. Maybe there's personal gains. I don't have to go to school if I'm sick. And then a number of pre-injury factors or characteristics that have been identified as putting people at higher risk for long-term symptoms. So there's certain psychological predispositions. There's physical ones. For example, having a maternal history of migraines has shown those individuals would be at more risk for persistent effect. Having had previous concussions, certain personality characteristics, certain learning disabilities or mental health issues such as anxiety. So the big picture here is to show the complexity. Mild traumatic brain injury or concussion is not necessarily mild in its complexity. The biopsychosocial model here, again, I'm not expecting you to be able to read and digest all of this, but it's a model that's greatly helped me because it presents a framework to explain the etiology of post-concussive syndromes or symptoms, and it gives more detail to that iceberg and includes the injury effects. So we want to be able to think about how the neurophysiological symptoms interact again with other factors, such as the pre-injury psychological factors that I mentioned, or physical factors like a history of multiple concussions, or gender has been indicated that females may be more likely to have persistent effects. So the idea is that the biopsychosocial conceptualization allows us to look across different areas and remember that we need a broad conceptualization to think about an individual's profile, and that their response to the symptoms they have may indeed be creating additional symptoms and may worsen the actual symptoms from the neurophysiological changes. We apply these models, like the biopsychosocial model and the iceberg model, clinically by trying to look at possible mediators or risks. So this is an example of a checklist we might use when evaluating someone. We look to see if they have comorbid conditions that might make them at risk for persistent effects, or some of those iatrogenic or treatment-oriented factors, or psychological factors, or pre-injury factors. And certainly this would be a whole workshop. But I want to, again, underscore the importance of, or the complexity of looking across arenas in trying to understand the symptom presentation beyond just what the person's complaining about. What do I want you to remember from that is that there's multiple causes of academic challenges, cognitive deficits, somatic symptoms such as dizziness, light sensitivity, headaches, pain, fatigue, sleep issues. Those somatic symptoms can cause cognitive deficits. They might interact with existing cognitive deficits and make them worse. Same story goes for psychosocial challenges that may occur. Early supports. The symptom cluster, the types of symptoms an individual has, will drive who gets involved. These bullets remind us what should be in place. Who is on the team, again, will depend on what the individual needs. We need to have a progressive return to learn protocol. Psychoeducation, I'm going to say a little bit about both of those. And here is some bullets giving some examples of academic accommodations, and I'm going to give you some resources for those. So let's talk for a bit about early supports as a method to prevent persistent effects. So here is a progressive return to learn. This is from the CBERT website, and I encourage you to get on it. I know you know where it is since you're taking this webinar hosted by them. And you see these 6 steps. They've got some, they have it operationalized, how to gradually return somebody. Not everybody will go linearly. They might enter at step 4, they might skip some steps, but the notion is that you're individualizing that return and making it gradual and reactivating and getting them back as quickly as possible. And I give the website resource on the side there. Also from the same website, here's a list of academic accommodations. There's many, many lists like this. They divide it into some general accommodations, some accommodations specifically to help with cognitive or thinking issues, some accommodations to help with fatigue or physical symptoms, and some accommodations to help with emotional symptoms. Again, I won't take the time to go through all of those, but I encourage you to get on the website and you can download and print and have access to these helpful lists. Early psychoeducation. Psychoeducation is another very helpful avenue for mitigating symptoms and reducing the chance someone will go on for to have persistent effects. It's also very useful late in the game too. These are the 4 bullets that Dave Sifu, who's a prominent researcher in mild traumatic brain injury and concussion, lists. And they're kind of hallmarks of our counseling or our interaction with individuals who are coming to us with concussions. Let's look at them. So the first message is to let your patients or your students know that concussion is caused by a temporary minor disruption of some signals in the brain, which can cause very disruptive symptoms. So we emphasize that it's temporary, that they are minor, but they can cause very bothersome symptoms. We give messages around the fact that symptoms are predominantly related to the physical trauma and also from stress from the injury, from going through an ordeal, from not feeling well. And additionally, when people have concern about, am I going to get better? Am I going to be able to go back to school or back to my sport? That produces some issues. So we talk to them about how they're feeling about being injured and what their worries are, and their anxiety is going to also affect their symptoms. We provide reassurance in the form of letting them know that for most people, we can expect a rapid and full recovery. Okay, this again would be for people that are early on, and that we're here to support you. We're going to do some things to make that happen. And then finally, reactivation, the importance of returning to physical and cognitive and learning activity in school as soon as possible. We talk to them about the newest literature that's suggesting they can push themselves a bit above where they start to be symptomatic and there will not be a worsening. So I want to toggle back and forth between these very direct things that you might do with a youth you are working with and kind of more the models and how you have to have a structure to be able to implement who's going to do what and be able to provide those direct treatments. So this is a paper, relatively recent paper by Dactyl, and they talk about a collaborative model for returning to academics between athletic trainers and speech language pathologists. And they define it different roles, and it doesn't matter so much which discipline has which roles, but there's a knowledge base that the different roles would need to have. And I like this because instead of saying it's discipline specific, it can fit better. It can flexibly be applied to different contexts where people are in different roles. I also wanted to mention another model for early intervention, which is Karen McAvoy's response to intervention model that has layers of instructional supports that match students' needs, kind of this tier level that those of you in education know very much about. And I think it provides some great ideas early on that might be helpful to implement. This is her list, and in this reference is an additional list to the academic accommodation list that's on CBERT that you might want to take a look at. Let's see. Again, thinking about McAvoy's model, that article that goes with the table that was in the previous slide, the suggestion is to invest in those tier 1 supports. These are things like students receiving informal assessment, getting quick and early screening, some academic accommodations, such as on the list that we talked about earlier, some academic supports. So the suggestion is to invest in those early, which is important to remember. They also talk about having those driven by the classroom teacher. And they warn against too quickly moving to tier 2 and tier 3 supports with expensive, time-consuming 504 and IEPs. The one caveat I might get from a survey that we've done is that it's a lot to ask the general education teachers alone to do all the tier 1 supports, and it doesn't allow for talking to other disciplines. So that might be something we could layer on as a recognition that there's, in addition to the learning issues, there's the somatic issues and the physical issues and the psychological issues. And so consultation with specialists may be helpful even in very early stages. And so that's what this slide is underscoring, is that not every general educator can implement the accommodations. So we might need to think about models where other disciplines can be involved and provide some of those consultations on those tier 1 supports. In Oregon, we have the Regional Brain Injury Resource Team that's through CBERT, and trained team members may serve on evaluation and IEP teams. So that's an option for all of those of you who are Oregonians, and you can get on the CBERT website for that. If students remain symptomatic, we will want to bring in extra supports both in school and outside of school. And there's those resources. Sometimes the cognitive and learning symptoms persist, even if we do very excellent early supports. Students might benefit from protections under the 504 and IEP kinds of options, or supplemental clinical supports, which is what we would provide at our clinic in an outpatient clinic. Typically, things that are done involve the designation of assistive technology. There's some examples listed under that, or instructional modifications, and some examples are listed there. Let's talk about what are the kinds of supports that we might do in a clinical setting. So I'd like to focus the rest of the time sharing a little bit. I think that's what I was asked to do in this webinar, is talk about kind of the clinical pieces when we're providing cognitive rehabilitation for this process. I'm going to talk a bit about our assessment process, treatment options, and treatment process, pieces that people can adopt in their own educational or clinical settings as is useful. Reminder that the cause of the learning symptoms may be multifactorial. The overarching principles is that all assessment and intervention must be focused on function, that we have something we're working on, and collaborative, in other words, student-centered, and hopefully you'll be able to clearly see that as I go through. So here are our 3 assessment questions that drive our work with students who have concussions. What do you want to change? What matters to the student? We try to find that out. What's preventing you from reaching your goal? So what are the primary challenges, and what's going well? We want to identify the strengths and skills so we can build on them. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to keep those in mind. What do you want to change? What are the barriers, and what's going well? So let's think about that first question. This shows the range of functional goals that we address as a student responds to that first question. What is it they want to change? So often it's to improve their grades, maybe their overall GPA, course quizzes, or performance on assignments. Maybe it's increased assignment management. I'm not getting my homework in. I can't study effectively. Maybe it's improving academic skills, reading, writing, lecture comprehension, oral presentation. Maybe they need to boost course-specific knowledge. So before it was okay that they were a little iffy in math, but now with the concussion symptoms, they're struggling. Maybe they want to feel socially more socially connected. So those are the most 5 common groups of things that people will say, I need to X. When we say, if we were useful to you, what would we do? The second question, what's getting in the way, is usually related to one of these 4 issues. There's cognitive challenges, particularly working memory, okay, executive functions, kind of planning, organization, assignment management, and working memory would be kind of holding on to things, being able to take notes, being able to hold on what you're reading, and other attention problems. Those are things that we hear the most. Psychosocial variables, anxiety, motivation, confidence, knowledge gaps. I mentioned the pre-existing school challenges, or somatic variables, headache, fatigue, okay? So those 4 areas are very common. And then the third area, what are the strengths? If we're trying to leverage how they might get better, then these are some things we might ask them about. We want to find behaviors or scheduling approaches that seem to be working well. It's easier to leverage existing skills than to teach new ones. So we might ask them, tell me about a favorite class, or if we can't find anything at school, what are some successes you're having outside of school? What's an instance when studying what actually went well? And then we can use that as a ramp to be able to identify some intervention. I want to say a little bit about assessment, even though I know a lot of you out there wouldn't necessarily be giving these assessments. I think it's important to know that they exist, and if you're referring for supplementary clinical input, that you have an idea that they're there, or you may be a school psychologist that would be giving these assessments, or you may be talking to school psychologists. We decide as we do the clinical interview on those questions whether there is a need for further assessment based on their responses. And this is an example showing the different types of tools that we might list. I give some sample tests, but again, I'm not going to go through those because they're very discipline specific. So examples, we might have neuropsychological or standardized cognitive tests, like tests of memory, tests of information processing ability, performance-based tasks. There might be direct or indirect measures of function, like attendance logs, web-based assignments, or there's certain kinds of tests that ask people to do functional tasks that we can observe performance. There's clinician-reported scales, where clinicians observing and then filling out some scales. There's client or student-reported scales, like the ones we use the most often are learning study skills inventories and the post-concussive symptom scale, PCSS. The HIT is a headache index. And then goal attainment scaling, where we have clients report what they want to work on. And then for more medical issues, there may be instrumental kinds of testing, such as imaging. Okay, so there's different groups of tests. We think about the domains we want to test. So what are our questions? We have different tests. Are we trying to look at somatic symptoms like headache? Even if we're not doing that and somebody else is testing that, we want to have that information. Psychosocial functioning, again, there'll be somebody else that might be giving that. The cognitive tests, we're typically, again, looking at attention, executive functions, and cognitive batteries, and I list some samples there. School behavior, attendance logs. Sometimes schools have web-based documentation and information about missing assignments, and we can get our quantitative measures from that. Study skills inventory, I mentioned. The learning assessment for study skills inventory. And the other one is the motivation for studies. Actually, we just always say MSLQ. Sorry, I'm not remembering the full name, but it's about kind of motivation to learn and and both of them have good psychometrics. So you can get scores off those inventories. And again, knowledge gaps. Do they need a school psychologist or somebody to do math, writing, reading, comprehension kinds of tests? These are some additional considerations that help us make decisions on what tools and processes we may want. And the bottom line in assessment is a reminder that it's personalized, that we don't just give every student the same test. What is our question? We have hypotheses about what might be the barriers and challenges, and we may use testing to help us solve that. And these are some additional things we think about when we're selecting the tests. Is it a good test? Will it serve as a baseline measure and we can re-give it? And some of the functional feasibility issues, time, cost, and so forth. So this assessment and the clinical interview with those 3 questions helps us select treatment. These 5 buckets or categories of treatment are the most common ones we might use in a clinical setting. So I'm going to say a bit about some of these in a moment and give you an example, but I want you to kind of keep them in mind. So we may train people to use assistive technology for cognition. That's apps or devices such as a smart pen. Strategy training, that might be a study skills strategy or a self-talk strategy. Environmental management, mostly we do that for increasing organization or decreasing somatic symptoms. Direct attention training, drills paired with strategies that help increase somebody's attention. And then psychoeducation, teaching people about concussion, giving them a positive expectation to get better, helping them self-advocate for their needs. So those are the 5 broad buckets, if you will, of treatment that we might draw upon. These are the intervention principles that are equally important to the type of intervention we pick and we apply regardless of what type of treatment we're going to use. And so focusing on function again, trying to find things that are practical that people want to work on. And you see in the orange some examples of statements that might, illustrate that principle. Sounds like what's most important to you is passing biology, and we should figure out our therapy should work around that. Being collaborative. Do either of these 2 approaches that I'm thinking could be helpful, do either of them seem like they might be a good match for you and help you improve your grades? Establishing their current level. So measurement. Let's try to nail down where you are now, and that'll give us a starting point. So establish the anticipated level. If this intervention is helpful, if our time together is fruitful, where do you think you might be in 6 weeks? So getting them to set goals. We do levels of goal using goal attainment. And then we devise a measurement plan. Let's try to figure out who, what, when, where we'll measure this progress. So again, measurement, focusing on function is what we're applying as we get started in the intervention process. So these are some additional principles. We're always trying to build in an expectation for recovery. We're recruiting the most when you're feeling down. Like we try to, understand them and build in some resilience that'll be under their own steam that they can implement. Building trust in therapeutic alliance, coordinating with the relevant others, the teachers, the other team members, parents, and help them move towards self-management. You'll see a reference at the bottom here. This has come from an expert consensus group that was we developed with from an international group actually, and these are clinician guidelines for working with individuals with mild traumatic brain injury. That's more so we mentioned the importance of measurement. So I show you we have these worksheets. We help, and it shows also that principle of being collaborative. We've talked about several things you might be interested in working on, what seemed the most important. We build a measurement plan. You know, how often are you doing that strategy now? How often do you want to be doing it? You know, when it's helpful. Monitor. Okay. So I mentioned the importance of promoting positive expectations for recovery and this notion that words matter. So we're careful about the language we use. For example, if you use impairments versus challenges, you may have people more focused on disease versus challenges has the implication you might overcome it. Therapy versus strategies. Strategies has an implication it's under their own steam versus something that you are doing. Mild traumatic brain injury. It's something that they can overcome. Okay. And so we want to be careful with our language. So what I'd like to do now is talk about a couple of those intervention buckets, specifically the assistive technology bucket. And this, so I'm going to start with that. I have 4 bullets under there, and those are the tools that we tend to use the most often. The first 3 are the ones we tend to use most often. We'll use electronic readers with special reading comprehension software, or just the usual that comes on Adobe. A lot of people like using the smart pens that as you write, record what the lecture is, and then you can go back and easily just listen to bookmarked sections of the lecture where you were confused without having to go back and forth in a tape recorder, for example. Tablets and iPads and phones with all kinds of apps and software that may help with organization, may help with memory, may help with certain kinds of skills. So I'll be talking about a few examples. Recording text. So there's a large gamut of tools that can reduce the load on the cognitive learning, the cognitive and learning load and assist students. Another one of those big intervention buckets was strategies. We do a lot with this population of teaching study skills, again, to make them more efficient. We usually have a little spiel that talks about until the strategy becomes automatic and overlearned, they won't get the benefit. So we try not to have people judge while they're still learning it. And these are some of them that we do the most often. Reading comprehension and retention strategy, I'm going to give you an example of that. Writing strategies, test-taking strategies, note-taking strategies like Cornell Notes, lecture comprehension and retention strategies. So we have a number of approaches within each of these strategies. We would show a student what they might be, and then they might select what seems to be a good match for them. Going back to the assistive technology, and thinking back to the slide that talked about the functional goals, I wanted to say a little bit about assignment management, because that seems to be a biggie that people want to address. The ability to turn in their homework, to remember what their homework is, to do it, is something that is frequently problematic in this population. So we use task management apps, homework management apps, and metacognitive strategies to help with that. Okay. Another functional goal area in addition to assignment management, and I mentioned was the management of somatic symptoms. The somatic symptoms can be the biggest barrier to returning to learn. Sleep disorders impact everything. Disrupted sleep makes it very hard to be effective at school. So we partner with psychologists, and we have become quite good at using our behavioral intervention supports to help people with sleep hygiene. We discern whether people are having trouble staying asleep versus falling asleep, as those are two different profiles and require different types of responses. Screen behavior, so the use of phones or being on screen too close to trying to go to sleep has been determined to be disruptive to sleep, so we help people set goals to get off their screens. Headache management. I've put a website that I really like a lot that I got from a local neurologist here. And it allows people to kind of simulate their headaches so they can show people what their headache's like. It also kind of demystifies some of the headache and kind of does that positive expectation for improvement and puts some of the monitoring of the symptoms and management strategy in the hands of the student. And we've had a couple people really be helped with headache management tips from this website. We might assist people with symptom monitoring triggers, response, and effect. We also have people monitor when they're less symptomatic and try to get them to see when that was, like, oh, when I wasn't on my phone as much, it wasn't as much fun. I got better sleep last night. And again, with an eye towards what can they do to have better behavioral health in order to manage some of their symptoms, and certainly coordinating with physicians, if people are on medications and so forth, is an important piece of helping people manage their symptoms. Another functional goal area I mentioned was the self-advocacy and psychoeducation. So we talked a bit about messaging and the words we use and kinds of some of the messages we want to give to this population. We also talked about accommodations could be considered part of this, or it could be considered part of the strategies. Tied to accommodations is the notion of having people advocate for what they need in order to reduce their symptoms, and again, to increase that self-monitoring and self-regulation. So there's lots of examples of accommodations for different types of issues, and I encourage you to look at the Siebert accommodations. I will give a caveat that the idea with the accommodations is that they're temporary. And what we want to do is then reduce the need for accommodations as the student recovers and as they start using their strategies and their capacity improves. So I think it's important to visit and set time limits and revisit the accommodations in order to help emphasize that recovery process. The dynamic coaching model is, we've really been talking about that in all of our time together here. It's a reminder that regardless of the approach, we want to help students again self-regulate. So whether we are using assistive technology and teaching them to use a smart pen, or whether we're doing some environmental management or the psychoeducation and teaching them about concussion and what they can do, we want them to be in the driver's seat. So the steps in blue relate to the identification of an achievable goal. So that was that first assessment question. What is it that's important to you? Well, I want to feel less anxious during tests. I want my grades to go up. We select a doable goal. And then we go through that discernment process thinking about those 5 buckets and try to identify potential strategies or treatment or solution. We create steps and materials for that. Okay, so the steps in red are about the strategy knowledge. And then the green steps are really the implementation phase. So a lot of this happens not in a clinic session with us, but outside when they're at school or when they're home doing their homework. So we make a plan for them to initiate the strategy or the approach that we've been working on. We make a plan for them to monitor how well it's using and to track its performance. That's the measurement plan I was referring to. And then when they come back to us in the purple, it's the comparison process. So let's look at how it worked. Did it achieve what you were hoping for achieve? How could we tweak it? Do we need a different strategy? So this is something that we're a very internalized process, and you'll see that only some of that takes place face-to-face with us, and a lot of it is placing and helping placing the responsibility with support to help the student be part of the selection and the self-monitoring and the modifications in order to do the things that are going to help them manage their concussion symptoms as they're recovering. So in a nutshell, we might say that we pick an approach with some sort of associated goal attainment scale, like how their grades are going to get better. We train and practice whatever the strategy is, and that's sometimes the stuff that's not sufficiently supported, and so that might be what we do in our therapy, and we monitor and adjust. So what I'd like to do now is kind of take maybe a 10,000-foot view of the case in our clinic last spring, and then talk about what we did and really apply some of these sort of abstract principles that I've been talking about and how they helped this woman. So this is a female, 16-year-old female who was 7 months post-spinal traumatic brain injury from a motor vehicle accident. And she's the one you've been hearing me kind of refer to. A typical goal is, I really need to get my biology grade. She wanted to go to college. She was failing biology. So we go through our assessment process and we determine, we figure out what the barriers are. So one of the barriers was headaches when she was reading and reading her textbook. So we do an exploration of what's causing the headache, some of those symptom monitoring. And she said, well, the fluorescent lights bug me, and here's where I read my biology text. So could she read it somewhere else? Could we try to change the lighting and see if that would be helpful? So again, through a process of discernment that she's involved with, one of the approaches we used was environmental modification. Let's look at changing the lighting. Another one that she said, even if I'm reading it, I don't feel like I'm holding on to it. So some reading comprehension and retention strategy. We looked at some options for that. She selected that as a potential outcome. And then she was one of those very frequent patients who said, I just can't, I lose my attention over time. So we looked at some different apps that help you focus your attention. So let's see how these worked. This is the Focus Booster app. It's an app that allows the student to segment time. You can say how long you're going to work before taking a break. And then you can say what you're going to do in the break: stretch, get water, rest your eyes, do some mindfulness work. So that might be something we would help them with. And the default time is 25 minutes, and then there's a 5-minute break. So she tried that, but she did not like it. So that's part of that dynamic coaching. She didn't like the interface. It kind of made her feel anxious when it was counting down. So that wasn't going to be a good solution. So we tried another app. This one's called Forest Stay Focused app. And the tree grows if you keep it open. But if you leave the app and aren't sticking to your task, the tree dies. And the main point I want to have is that by involving her in the selection and in the outcome measurement, it increased her use. And we were able to get a tool that was helpful. Similarly, we showed her several reading comprehension programs. This is the one she settled on. It's one we've developed here in our clinic, where it divides the reading process into things you do before reading, while you're actively reading, and right as you're winding down reading. So, for example, the preview before reading, you read all the headings, kind of create a schema, and all the you plan for how much you're going to read, and then you read the headings and give yourself kind of a schema and the figure captions. Then while you're reading, there's highlighting, taking notes in your own words, and periodically reviewing in chunks. And then 5 minutes before your kind of end, you review your notes you've taken and your highlights, you summarize, you do a grand summary, and then you test yourself. So we worked on that, and that was very helpful for her. And then I wanted to say that the change in lighting she reported didn't make her headaches go completely away, but minimized them so she felt she could stick with her reading. So that kind of in a nutshell for one client, showing you the application of having different kind of intervention options, thinking about a focus on function and having some goals. She had, her desire was to get a B, but in which she, I think, ended up with a B-, so we almost got there. And you can get an idea of how we then applied it to a client. What I want to do now, the last time, about 2 minutes we have together, is end with listening to a actual student talk about her concussion. I want to end with why we're here. We often have our students do their recovery stories as part of their therapy if they're working on that psychoeducation bucket, that one intervention bucket. And this is a student whose life had changed. I'm going to do a couple of minutes. You'll hear her talking about how she got the concussion. And then she came to us about a year after her difficulty, and by then had chronic issues, was not doing well in school. But with support, she went on to pursue college classes successfully. And so I thought it would be interesting to hear a little bit about her chronicling that. So I'm going to skip around in the video and do a segment from the beginning for 2 minutes, and then have her say something about what was most helpful, and then end with her kind of inspiration. Okay, let's see if my tech skills will get us.
My most recent happened when I was playing college soccer in 2011. I was hit during practice. I was a goalkeeper. I made a save off my temple. And I didn't realize at the time I had a concussion, and so I kept playing. And I remember feeling really terrible at our games that weekend, and I attributed it to really hot weather. And I came back and got hit again that Monday in the same spot and continued to play. And I played for about another week, and then I realized something was wrong when I couldn't see straight after practice. And that's when I finally went to my athletic trainer and said I needed to go to the doctor. It should have been apparent, but it wasn't. And so I kind of had to figure it out on my own. And then once I did and was diagnosed with the concussion, I didn't really receive any support from my teammates or my coaches or my athletic trainer, which was really tough. Playing again. The later symptoms, I had headaches off and on. Trouble sleeping was a huge one. I was only able to sleep for a couple hours at a time, and that was it. Was having a really hard time in school as far as trying to process information and remember. I would put in a lot of hours studying and not remember anything that I had. A matter of being okay with sharing. One of the most helpful things in therapy was working with the LiveScribe pen. It's been really helpful taking notes and lecture with it, because it's really hard for me to pay attention to what the teacher's saying and write it down, because by the time I start writing it down, I forget and I just get really lost. So it's helpful to have the pen that records the lecture, and I can just bookmark and write simple one-word sentences to kind of remember what the same thing, and just kind of breaking stuff down that way. Yeah, I think, the biggest thing for me was I took a lot for granted before my concussion, as far as how easy things were academically, which I don't now. I really value learning, whether it be in school or outside of school. And I also kind of reestablished my identity, found other.
Okay, I'm going to stop us there, but again, I think hearing from the voice of someone who's been there is most useful. What I'll do now is take questions from the chat for those of you that have a few more minutes, and then I'll answer them orally.
Okay, thank you so much, McKay. This is Amanda again here at Seabird. And one of the questions that we have is from Gianna Simon. She wanted to know, have any studies been done about carbohydrate loading right after concussion so as to provide increased glucose for healing?
I probably wouldn't, I don't know that specific study. What I'm most familiar with is the use of giving supplements that increase glutamate. And, but again, because I focus a lot more on the people that are later, I'm a little less familiar with the initial medical management.
Okay, Jesus, thank you. Anyone else have any other questions? This is your time to ask them. Okay, well, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. Several people are saying thank you, McKay. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here.
Okay.